The HOA president didn't just cross the line. She doused it in gasoline and watched it burn with a smile. I can still feel the sting of her hand across my face, the sound echoing across the pasture as my daughter looked on in horror. She marched onto my ranch like she owned the place, told my 10-year-old girl she had no right to be there, and then slapped me across the face when I defended my child. And why? Because she claimed our private creek belonged to the community, waving around some mysterious paperwork she could barely explain. Her designer heels sank into the mud as she stood her ground, completely unaware that I'm the county sheriff. And this was about to get very, very ugly for her. I've lived on this ranch my entire life, every one of my 42 years. My grandfather homesteaded this land in the late 1800s. My father was born in the small cabin that now serves as my study, and I helped my own father build the main house when I was just a teenager. My daughter, Sarah, is the fifth generation to run barefoot through these pastures, to climb the old oak trees that have stood watch over this land for longer than any of us can remember. The ranch spans 300 acres of rolling hills, pristine meadows, and dense woodlands. But the heart of it all is the creek that runs straight through the back pasture. That creek has watered our livestock, provided fish for our table, and served as the backdrop for countless family memories. It has been in my family's name for over 100 years, documented in yellow deeds and county records. But the new HOA president decided she wanted it for herself. And when someone tries to mess with my family, with my child, with my legacy, they're in for a fight they won't forget. It all started about 6 months back when a new family moved into the big modern house right across from the ranch entrance. The house was a monstrosity of glass and steel, completely out of place in our rural community of ranch-style homes and rustic cabins. The woman of the house, Eleanor Winters, was exactly the kind of person you picture when you hear the word Karen. Perfect blonde hair never out of place, oversized sunglasses even on cloudy days, and an ego big enough to cast its own shadow. She arrived with a husband who seemed to exist only in the background, and 2 teenage children who looked as miserable as trapped raccoons. At first, she sent me polite little letters in the mail, printed on expensive cream-colored paper with the HOA letterhead embossed at the top. They were worded carefully, almost friendly, asking if I consider opening up the creek for neighborhood use, suggesting that it would be wonderful for community bonding and such a shame to keep such a beautiful natural resource all to ourselves. I tossed them in the trash. It's private property, plain and simple. The creek isn't just a pretty feature. It's a working part of our ranch, providing water for our small herd of cattle and serving as a boundary marker for our property. But the letters kept coming, each one more demanding than the last. The polite requests turned to implied threats, mentioning property values and community standards. Then came the official-looking violation notices claiming that I was obstructing community access to natural resources. I still ignored them, figuring she would eventually get the message. Then came the rumors around town. Eleanor had been telling people at the grocery store, at the school pickup, at the local diner that the creek was indeed community property and that I was hoarding it. She claimed to have done extensive research and found historical documents proving her case. Most people laughed it off. Everyone in town knew my family and knew the history of our ranch. But some of the newer residents, the ones who didn't know the area's history, started to wonder. The situation escalated when I came home from work one evening to find a group of people picnicking by the creek. When I asked them to leave, they told me that Eleanor from the HOA had said it was community property and that they had every right to be there. I had to politely but firmly explain that they were trespassing and would need to leave. They seemed genuinely surprised and embarrassed, but the damage was done. Word got back to Eleanor, and she was not happy. The final straw came on a beautiful Saturday morning in early June. I was out by the creek with my daughter, Sarah, teaching her how to fish like my father had taught me. Our fishing poles were propped on forked sticks. The morning sun was glinting off the water, and we were sharing a thermos of hot chocolate when I saw her marching down the pasture in heels. Eleanor Winters, dressed in designer jeans and a crisp white blouse, was making a beeline for us, her face set in a determined scowl. She didn't even bother using the gate, She just climbed right over the fence, her heels sinking into the soft earth. Sarah watched her approach with wide eyes, her small hands tightening around her fishing rod. "You need to leave," Eleanor told my daughter, who's only 10. Her voice was sharp, condescending. "This area is for community use, not private parties." My girl just stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "But this is my dad's ranch," Sarah said, her voice small but firm. Eleanor ignored her and turned to me. "Sheriff, I've asked you repeatedly to comply with HOA regulations regarding community property. This creek is community property. The HOA says so." I walked up, keeping my voice calm for Sarah's sake. "Ma'am, this is my land. Always has been. You're trespassing." She smirked, reaching into her expensive leather tote bag. "Not according to these." She pulled out a crumpled manila folder, stuffed with photocopied maps and half-legible legal notes. The documents looked like something she'd printed from the internet, with highlighted sections and handwritten notes in the margins. None of it made sense, but she waved it around like it was the Constitution. "These are historical records showing that the creek bed was designated as a public waterway in 1898, she said, tapping a highlighted section on one of the papers. "That designation was never formally revoked, which means it still stands." I glanced at the document. It was a photocopy of a photocopy, barely legible, with no official seals or signatures. "Ma'am, that document refers to the main river that runs through the county, not this creek, which is entirely on my property. This creek has been in my family's name since my grandfather homesteaded this land." I told her to leave twice. That's when she stepped forward and slapped me across the face. The sound echoed across the pasture, sharp and shocking. Sarah gasped, dropping her fishing rod. I could feel the sting, the heat spreading across my cheek, but what hit harder was a sheer disrespect. Not just to me as the property owner, but to me as a law enforcement officer, and most unforgivably, in front of my child. Instead of leaving, she pulled out her phone and called the cops. "Yes, I need an officer," she said into the phone, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "There's a dangerous man threatening me and my right to use community water. He's becoming aggressive. Please send someone immediately." Now, here's the part she didn't know. When she called the sheriff's office dispatch, she was calling me. I'm the county sheriff, have been for 12 years. I recognized the dispatcher's voice on the other end of the line, asking for her location and the nature of her emergency. While she was still on the phone, I pulled out my badge and held it up. "Ma'am, I think you've made a mistake." Her face went pale, her perfectly composed expression crumbling into shock. She ended the call abruptly, her hand shaking slightly. That should have been the end of it. A reasonable person would have apologized, retreated, and perhaps reconsidered their approach. But no, Eleanor Winters was not a reasonable person. She doubled down. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low and threatening. "The HOA has rights, and we will exercise them. I'll be back with the entire board to inspect this property tomorrow." I knew exactly what that meant. A bunch of people snooping around, looking for anything they could use against me. They would photograph every inch of the property, looking for violations, real or imagined. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. The next morning, I was ready. I had the property deeds from 1921 laid out on the porch table, along with aerial maps showing the property boundaries, water rights documents, and signed statement from my neighbors confirming the historical use of the creek. When the HOA inspection team arrived, Eleanor plus 4 other board members, all looking uncomfortable, I invited them to sit down and look through the records. But the president refused. "We're not here to see your paperwork," she said, her nose in the air. "We're here to enforce community rights. This creek belongs to everyone, and we're here to ensure access." I told them, "Community rights stop where my fence starts. This is private property, has been for over a century. You're trespassing, and I'm asking you to leave." For the next week, it turned into a Cold War. They sent me violation notices for unapproved fencing and obstructing community access. They cited me for a failure to maintain community property regarding the creek bed. I ignored them all, piling them up in a folder on my desk. Then they started parking cars along the fence line, hoping to annoy me into compliance. Every morning, I'd wake up to find 3 or 4 cars parked just outside my property line, their occupants sitting in folding chairs, pretending to enjoy the view, but really just trying to intimidate me. They would leave litter behind, coffee cups, snack wrappers, and I'd have to clean it up. I could have written tickets. I could have towed every car. As the sheriff, I had the authority to deal with this situation swiftly and decisively. But I wanted this to end in a way that left no room for argument, no possibility of Eleanor claiming I had abused my position or power. So I took a day off work and went to the county courthouse, diving into the archives. I pulled every water rights record in the archive related to my property, tracing the ownership back to the original homestead claim. I found surveyor's maps from the early 1900s, court documents from a boundary dispute in the 1950s, and water rights certificates that had been renewed every decade without fail. It was all there in black and white. The creek, the land it runs through, and the banks on either side are mine. Not just now, but legally for over a century. While I was at the courthouse, I ran into Old Man Henderson, whose family has owned the adjacent ranch for nearly as long as mine has been in my family. When I told him about the situation, he shook his head in disgust. "That woman's been nothing but trouble since she moved here," he said, spitting tobacco juice into a nearby planter. Tried to tell me I needed to paint my barn because it didn't fit with the community aesthetic. Told her my barn was painted red when her daddy was still in diapers, and it would be red long after she's gone. He offered to write a statement confirming the historical use of the creek by my family, which he did on the spot, signing it with a flourish that was barely legible but unmistakably authentic. Word got around town about what was happening, and I started receiving support from unexpected places. The local historical society offered to provide documentation about the settlement of the area and the original homestead claims. Several longtime residents stopped by with stories about playing at the creek as children, always with the permission of my family. Even the mayor called me, offering to mediate if necessary. But Eleanor was undeterred. She sent a letter to the local newspaper claiming that I was abusing my position as sheriff to deprive the community of its natural resources. The editor, knowing me and knowing the history of the area, refused to print it, but that didn't stop Eleanor from posting it on community social media pages, where it sparked heated debate. The HOA called an emergency meeting at their clubhouse for the following Tuesday evening. The notice was posted throughout the neighborhood, and the agenda item was listed as community property rights enforcement. I decided to attend, in uniform. When I walked into the clubhouse, wearing my full sheriff's uniform, including my duty belt and sidearm, the room fell silent. Eleanor was standing at the front, about to begin the meeting. Her smile faded when she saw me, her eyes widening slightly before she composed herself. "Sheriff," she said, her voice tight, "this is a private HOA meeting. You're not welcome here." I held up a piece of paper. "Actually, according to your own bylaws, which I obtained from the county clerk's office, HOA meetings are open to all residents of the community. I am a resident, so I have every right to be here." I took a seat in the back row, the stack of county documents in my lap. The meeting proceeded with other business, a discussion about landscaping requirements, a debate about parking restrictions, all of which I ignored. Finally, they got to the agenda item about the creek. Eleanor stood up, holding up a copy of the same document she had waved at me by the creek. "As I've discovered through extensive research," she began, "the creek that runs through the back of the sheriff's property is actually community property. Historical records from 1898 designate it as a public waterway, and that designation was never formally revoked." She went on, spinning a tale of community rights and shared resources, painting me as a selfish hoarder who was using his position to deprive children of the joy of playing in the creek. It was quite a performance, and I could see some of the newer residents nodding in agreement. When she finished, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. I laid the stack of county documents on the table in front of her. "These are certified legal records proving the creek is private property," I said, my voice calm but carrying throughout the room. "This includes the original homestead claim from 1898, which specifically mentions the creek as part of the property. These are surveyor's maps from 1905, 1923, 1947, and 1971, all showing the creek within my family's property boundaries. These are water rights certificates issued to my grandfather in 1910, renewed by my father in 1965, and by me in 2010. And this, I said, tapping a final document, is a court order from 1952 dismissing a claim by the county that the creek was public property, with the judge ruling that it has always been and remains private property. One of the board members, a man who had lived in the community for 30 years, whispered something about misunderstandings, but it was too late. I looked directly at Eleanor. Your continued harassment is not only unfounded, it's illegal. You've trespassed on my property. You've encouraged others to do the same. You've filed false reports with law enforcement, and you've publicly defamed my character. I paused, letting my words sink in. If any HOA member steps foot on my land without my permission again, I will treat it as criminal trespassing, and I will press charges to the fullest extent of the law. And then I handed Eleanor a citation, not for trespassing, but for assault. You put your hands on me in front of my daughter, I said, my voice dropping slightly. That's not going away. You have 30 days to appear in court to answer this charge. The room went dead silent. Eleanor's face went from pale to bright red. She tried to speak, but I cut her off. This meeting is adjourned, I said, and walked out of the room. From that day forward, no one from the HOA set foot on my property again. The cars stopped parking along my fence. The letters stopped arriving in my mailbox. Eleanor resigned as HOA president 2 days later, citing personal reasons, and within a month, her house was on the market. I heard through the grapevine that they moved to a gated community in Florida, which seemed about right. The new HOA president, a retired teacher who had lived in the community for 20 years, came by my office a week after Eleanor's resignation. She apologized for the trouble, assured me that the HOA had no claim to my property, and asked if there was anything they could do to make amends. I told her that respecting property rights would be a good start, and she agreed. The creek stayed just the way my family intended, quiet, peaceful, and ours. Sarah and I continued our fishing trips, and she even started learning how to fly fish, a skill my grandfather had passed down to my father, who had passed it down to me. The creek remained a sanctuary, a place where we could connect with each other and with the generations that had come before us. My daughter still talks about that day, not because she saw her dad stand up to the HOA, but because she learned something important. No one gets to take what's yours if you know how to stand your ground. She saw that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it would be easier to just give in and avoid conflict. She learned that property rights aren't just abstract legal concepts. They're about protecting the places that matter, the places that hold our history and our memories. As for me, the experience reinforced something I had always known, but sometimes forget in the day-to-day business of being sheriff. That the law is a powerful tool for protecting what matters, but only if you have the courage to use it. It also reminded me that knowing your history, understanding where you come from, and having the documentation to prove it can make all the difference when someone tries to rewrite your story. Now, when Sarah and I sit by the creek, watching the water flow over the smooth stones that have been there since long before my grandfather's time, I feel a sense of peace and continuity. This land is our legacy, our connection to the past, and our gift to the future. And no HOA president, no matter how determined, no matter how many historical documents she waves around, can ever take that away. Power doesn't give you the right to bully people. And when you mess with a sheriff's daughter, you'd better be prepared to face the consequences. Because some of us have taken an oath to protect and serve, and that starts with our own families. Subscribe for more stories about HOAs getting what they deserve.